Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to talk, our webinars on, so you're paying for Office 365, but do you have a strategy to maximize your ROI? The agenda for today's webinar, I'm going to introduce myself. We're going to talk about what ROI really looks like in Office 365. We're going to talk about pitfalls and challenges. And we're going to talk about a strategy to maximize that ROI. We're going to talk about using the applications together to drive adoption, change management and governance. And then I'm going to share with you some key takeaways from this presentation. And we're going to talk about the next upcoming webinar in the series that we're working on. So I'm the Director of Strategy and Advisory Services at Xgility. I have a 20+ year career in all things technical. At the beginning, it was more of a technology support, hardware, software, but really moved into the SharePoint Online on-prem and into Office 365. SharePoint 2007 is what brought me to consulting. And I've spent the last 13 years focusing on consulting and implementation and support of SharePoint and Office 365. The last 2 years focused primarily on strategy and advisory about getting into Office 365. So what is ROI in Office 365? The simple answer is it's adoption, right? Where users are excited and they're engaged in the rollout and the adoption process. And it also requires that you have a logical and methodical approach to getting Office 365 implemented and adopted. That seems rather simple though, right? Let's dig a little further into what that really looks like. Getting the tools deployed is simple. It's a flip of a switch, but getting users to continue to use those applications on a regular basis and really engage with each other is the most critical piece to adoption, which in turn gives you that ROI. And real business, your business transformation is going to take place when they're using them and collaborating together. To me, if the best part about this is when we start to see users actually coming up with their own ideas and taking the next step from what you expect of them and actually taking it to the next level. And that's when you get real adoption. But what does that look like? So I can give you example after example. I talk to people every day. I'm with customers every day. And real adoption is active Microsoft Teams. I say active on purpose because you can have many teams. But if they're not active and people aren't using them, then you're really not looking at adoption. The other thing that real adoption looks like is that your users and your staff feel connected to each other. In an age where we're remote workers, sometimes 100% remote, but many times several days a week remote, people feeling engaged and connected to others on their team and being able to feel like they can reach out and do real collaboration with that team is important. To me, that's the key to implementing Teams, and Teams sort of is the hub of that. The other thing that I've noticed over the last couple of years is the excitement that's generated by these tools. I told you I come from a long history of SharePoint, and I became a consultant in when 2007, MOS 2007 came out, but I'm more excited about the tools that are available now from Microsoft than I was back then. And that says something because they're powerful, they're easy to use, and they really speak to the users and usability. And the other key is getting all generations of the workforce engaged, right? What does that mean? That means not only is the younger generation or the early the people in their early careers engaged. Those are the ones who want to use these tools because they're available to them, but also those who have been in their careers for a while, watching those who have been in their careers for a while actually take on the tools and work with the younger generation. It's actually very interesting to watch. And buy-in. When you have different reasons for different levels of the organization to take on adoption, that helps to drive real adoption. But what does that mean for modern workplace? Microsoft uses modern workplace, and it looks different now than the traditional intranet that we've always dealt with. But can you imagine a place where on your intranet or in your environment you have no problems with permissions? It's one of the things with SharePoint that we always struggled with is issues with permissions or outdated files. That leads to search problems or people finding things from 2010 that exist out there when it's 2019. How about checked out files? No checked out files, no problems with news or announcements or tasks or calendaring, because those issues have been resolved with some of the new features and functionality available. And I can't say this enough, that people want to access your intranet because they know it's useful, relevant content that is available to them, searchable to them, and available at any time. And where governance and compliance are simple. We always really had issues with SharePoint in governance and being able to ensure that users were not sharing or not making available content that they didn't need to. One of the key focuses too on ROI is what that does to your network, or what the IT department can gain from real user adoption. And one of the things that we've seen time and time again in ROI for organizations is a significant reduction in email, where people are using tools like Teams to communicate and collaborate, where they're not sharing a 100 megabit file with 20 people, not being able to know when the latest update happened, whether or not they're looking at their email and they see the most relevant, or having to merge those changes that are happening within there in order to be able to communicate. So the significant reduction in email traffic and network traffic is really important. And I only can imagine that every single one of you that is on this call have some type of third-party application that your users are using. Many times they're going to third-party applications to avoid some of the restrictions or guardrails that we have on them. And so having no third-party applications where your data is being taken outside of the organization is very significant. And where your IT staff can fully support your users, not have to worry about being able to support them because the tools are simple. And having governance policies in place, that's critical to your organization's data. That's real ROI. So before we go any further, I'd like to get an idea. It's important to me, and I'm curious about where you are in your journey to Office 365. So we're going to present a quick poll here. And if you could take a second and respond to that poll, that will really help me get an idea of where you are. So if you'll select between we haven't started, we haven't even migrated email, or we've only migrated email to Office 365. But we've deployed email in OneDrive for Business. That's about it. Deployed email, OneDrive for Business, and you have a significant SharePoint implementation already, probably migrated from on-prem into the cloud. And then all of the above, and you've already deployed other tools like Teams and Yammer. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to respond. All right, great. Thank you very much. Wow. Okay. So the majority of you are actually at a point where you've implemented Office 365. You have SharePoint, and you've rolled out Teams and Yammer. I would imagine, based on that number, we're going to talk to all of the levels, but I would actually imagine that you're probably in a position where the entire thing looks like a big knotted up ball of string, because that's where people start to where the tools and using the tools and how you're going to help your users to actually get that ROI or the adoption that we talked about early on. And that's a struggle. I see it every day where we talk to customers every day who are in this position. But I'm gonna help you with that. But first, let's talk about some of the pitfalls and challenges that you have, no matter what level you're at. So if you haven't started or you've only migrated email to the cloud, you're not quite sure probably where to begin. That's where many of our customers come to us and say, I don't know what's next, can you help me? Or you don't have staff to be able to support the applications. More than likely, if you haven't done that already, you're probably concerned about the deprecation of Skype for Business. That's going away, and you're going to have no choice but to implement Teams for any kind of internal communication and chat with others, especially if you have any kind of telephony involved. And I thought I put this quote in here because I actually heard this last week from a customer. And they said, well, I'm not really sure what to do because people aren't going to use the tools anyway, just like every other application that we've deployed. That's a little disheartening, right? And when you hear those things or you feel like that, you don't want to put your time and energy and effort into something. But I promise you, if you just hold on for a little bit, we're going to talk about some of the strategies here that we can help you with and that you can sort of wrap your head around. And then in some of the later sessions that we do or some of the later webinars that we do, we're going to talk about expanding on that topic. All right, so even more complicated is you've granted access or you granted licensing to small groups or departments. To me, this is sort of the putting your toe in the water, right? You're giving people licenses when they ask for them. But there's sometimes more chaos with this than there would be just to deploy it to everyone, right? Because you have pockets of users using Teams and Planner and Yammer, but there's no one organization-wide, you're not using it, and so you're not getting that full benefit. And inter and intra department inconsistencies. That's huge. If one group is using Teams for communication and meeting setup, and others are still using Skype for Business and having, trying to figure out which tool to use when and for which group is really frustrating for users. And again, you've got cloud applications, third-party applications out there. More than likely, if you've got this going on, the reason why they're asking you for the licensing is because they're already using something outside the organization. They're trying to comply. They're trying really hard to stay within Office 365, but it's just not available to them. The last bullet here that the last point here, the one that's bold, I don't want to deal with the sprawl that comes with these tools. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say, I have to control everything. I have to set up teams for people. I have to decide what the team names are going to be and decide what the channel structure is going to be because I don't want to deal with the sprawl. And I'm going to ask you to hang on here for a little bit because the huge impact of allowing your users to just run with the applications and run with Teams is going to be a major step in getting adoption. And then we'll talk about governance on the back end. So you really switch from being controlling of the tools and then being able to govern them. So if you've got SharePoint in the mix, which looks like the majority of you do, I'm sort of going to say some real things here. I come from SharePoint, but the number of times I've seen people migrate content from 2007 to 2010 to 2013, we've seen it. And you have files that are, however many years old that have gone through several migrations, and you're really doing nothing but moving the content as it existed all of this time. And that's not really what you want, right? It's the easiest way to do it, but it's not getting adoption. And the reason that you've done that is because you put a lot of energy and effort and dollars into your SharePoint environment. And it's easiest just to do a lift and shift. And in some ways, that's a good thing. We can talk about migrating content, but with a plan and a process to really get your users to want to use the new tools that are available. And permissions, every single time that I've opened up a SharePoint environment, there are permission issues. Somebody has control that they shouldn't have, or they are the third generation of the person who's responsible for SharePoint, and they do what they're told because they have always done it that way, but they don't really understand it. SharePoint is an amazing product, but some of the challenges that we've always had with SharePoint, Microsoft has really addressed in some of the new tools, and it's what makes me excited about them. Other third-party apps, we've talked about that already. The one thing that I hear over and over again, and I actually have some customers who tell me we're not allowed to use the word SharePoint at all when we talk about Office 365, because the complication and some of the struggles that people have had with SharePoint have caused that to happen. And it's kind of a shame, because SharePoint is an amazing product for what it does well. We're going to talk about where that fits into the ecosystem and how powerful that is if you look at this from a holistic perspective. But why is this? It's because Microsoft has introduced these really great tools. And I talk about it in terms of we've opened up a fire hose, right? There's so many new things. We can pay attention to the roadmap. We can add information to user voice so that we can help to promote or ask for new changes or modifications to the applications. But the sheer volume, the number of applications that are coming at us, and when do I use this? And every day they're introducing something else. And you open up your the application, Teams, for example. It's a really great one. I've gotten to the point where I talk about it is what it is today, right now, because I can open up the application 5 minutes from now and there's a change. That's a really great thing, because we have changes when we need them, and they're making improvements every day, but it's very difficult and can be overwhelming to try to keep up with that. And I promise the confusion and the chaos and some of the things that you're dealing with are not because you're not trying, right? We're all really trying to wrap our heads around how this is going to work and really to get adoption. But people don't know what to use or how to use it. And so without a plan and a strategy and a way to get people into the cloud and to help you really unravel the string, it's almost impossible for you to get true adoption. And so I'm going to talk through some strategies over the next couple of minutes on how to really pull this thing apart and really get the most ROI out of Office 365. All right. So what is a strategy for Office 365 implementation? And this is our methodology that we've worked for about 2.5 years, really since Teams came out, to implement and perfect. And I'm going to talk to each of these, and then we're going to go into some specifics and what this really means. But the very first thing and the most important thing is to engage users from across the organization. That discovery and outcomes is really important to bring a core group of people together. You're going to hear things that you wouldn't necessarily hear from users when you start to involve them in the process. We're going to talk about adoption too, because you notice phase 4 includes sustained adoption activities. Well, what does that word sustained mean? It means that we're including adoption activities and change management principles throughout the implementation and the strategy sessions. And we're doing that on purpose, because we need to start change management and conversation about the change that's coming immediately, and then continue that messaging as we go through. And then we talk about what the tools are and really where you want to use those tools and how you expect users to use the tools, and then develop a plan. And if you don't have a plan and you don't write it down, then it will never come to fruition. You've got to talk about, what do the Office 365 applications mean in my organization? How am I going to message this to users? And then how am I going to govern this? And then continued rollout and adoption throughout the organization. We're going to go deep into some of these pieces now. So the very first thing that's so critical to getting ROI with Office 365 is to define how each new feature or application is going to be used in your organization. What do I mean by that? So if users don't know what you expect them to do with an application, then there's no way that they're going to use the right tool. I imagine you've probably heard many times, well, when would I use SharePoint versus when would I use Teams? And even more confusing is if you're technical enough, you know that on the back side of Teams is SharePoint. So I've gotten really used to and encourage people to start changing the language that they use. When we talk about a tool like Teams, we talk about it from the front end and the user perspective. And it is Teams, even though it's SharePoint on the back end. When we talk about SharePoint, we're talking about your intranet. And when, just being the language that we're talking about, but defining what that tool is. We're going to talk about some examples of that here, and why that's so important. So these are examples. These are examples that we've used with our customers before. It can be as granular and detailed as you need it to be for your particular organization, but defining the tools for what you expect of your users is critical. For example, if you're not going to allow external sharing out of Teams or SharePoint, you've got to give a place for your users to be able to share externally. And typically that's OneDrive, right? Maybe that's the first step that you take into external access into your tenant. And so defining for your users when and where they need to use OneDrive for Business is important. Many times we see people migrating their shared directories into OneDrive, and then sharing from there once they're in OneDrive, then sharing with people inside of their organization. That's not necessarily, and again, that's a conversation that we always have and that you'll want to have inside your organization. But if OneDrive for Business, if you're introducing Teams to the organization, why would you want your users to have access or share outside of or collaborate with others in the organization from OneDrive? Why not use the tool that's meant for that, and that is Teams? And so when we talk about Teams, we talk about organizational collaboration, right? So where we're working with projects or departments or cross-functional teams. And the highlighted thing, the italicized piece on this Teams is where you can be more specific on what you really want to say to your users. Like, teams are created without any involvement from IT. The first time I said those words in front of somebody, people said, well, you're throwing IT under the bus. And I think the message is many times users feel like they're being controlled. Again, I think I said I come from an IT background where we want to have control over everything, but sometimes messaging to users that they can take this on themselves and they can create the environment themselves in a matter of seconds is a really powerful way to get people engaged and want to participate. And SharePoint, I said we'd talk about where SharePoint fits. Many of the issues that we've traditionally had with SharePoint involve collaboration. It involves permissioning in order to allow people to come in and edit content and be able to check in and check out. And so if we add Teams in the mix here and we remove that collaboration element from SharePoint and we move that collaborative environment into Teams, then what we're left is a place for dissemination of information or consumption by the users, where we can lock down permissions. You don't need to have a combination of editing and admin or viewing permissions in order to make that happen. And it really clearly helps to do that. The other things that we always struggled with in SharePoint were things like task management. Planner is a perfect example of where we can take task management out of that and put it into a different application. But again, focusing the application for what Microsoft intends for it to be, what it's really good at, no matter which one of these it is, and how your organization wants to define that tool. And for those of you that are using Yammer, that makes it a very easy conversation, because Yammer really is the place to connect and really have that social environment and allow users to connect to each other in a way that they never have before, and find information from people and create relationships in the organization that were almost impossible, especially when you have such a remote workforce. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is governance. And when we talk about governance in Office 365, that's a huge topic. And I'm going to touch on it a little bit here, but our next webinar is going to cover adoption and governance specifically. And we're going to do some deep diving into that. But when we talk about governance, we talk about it in this one, we're going to talk about it from two perspectives. We're going to talk about it from the tool perspective. Specifically, if we're talking about teams, we're talking about what the number of team owners is, or what the naming convention is that you have. Do you want to force a naming convention? You know, we can prepend and append name suffixes or something within the policies that you use. Do you really want to do that? Do you not want to do that? What are the pros and cons? What are your needs there that we should set for the applications? And then we can govern, or we can manage and set policies for those tools. If you haven't defined your tools in that first step, there's no way that you're going to be able to govern them, because how do you write policies for every possible scenario that your users are using the tools if you haven't put those guardrails around them? And when they're not using the tools the way that you expect, then you encourage and engage them again to understand what your intention is for those tools. But again, governance goes hand in hand with defining those tools. Define the tools so that you can have much easier governance over what users are doing in those tools. Messaging and story planning. I can't tell you the number of times that we talk about what is the story that you're trying to tell, and then how are we going to message that? What is the message that we're trying to send? The message that I said earlier about how I had a customer who didn't allow me to say SharePoint at all when we were talking about rolling out some of these tools. That made it very interesting. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that in the beginning, but it was interesting to watch that as we started to roll out the tools, that the users were frustrated. The users were frustrated with things about SharePoint, not SharePoint itself. They were frustrated with the issues that they had there. And when we showed them and messaged them and told them the story about why the tools, such as Teams, was being introduced and how it was going to alleviate some of the issues that they've always faced before, they started using the word SharePoint. And so it became this constant change of language, but the story that you tell and the way that you tell it is so important and can't be done by an outside person. You're the only people who can participate in a conversation to decide what that story is and what you need to do in order to get your employees engaged and drive adoption. Demonstrate and encourage using the tools together. Why is that so important? I think this is the single most transformational piece of adoption and the key to getting your users to understand why the tools are standalone, but they also work best when they're used together. I'm going to give you some examples here. So we talked through what we've defined the tools as, and I'm going to use the examples that I gave before, where OneDrive is your personal environment. OneDrive is where you have your personal files that aren't being shared with anybody else, that you're working on by yourself, or maybe you have there temporarily to share externally. And then SharePoint is defined as your consumption point or your dissemination point for providing policies and other things that your users need to have. And then Teams being used for collaboration and teamwork. That's where your calendaring happens. That's where your communications through the chat happens. That's where your communications with your teams through the conversations within the teams happens. And that's where the true co-authoring that comes along with Teams happens. And when you start to use Teams inside of this, again, to remove some of those struggles that you've had, that's the key there. And then when we introduce Yammer, it makes this really a full circle. And why is that? Because if I look at this from a process, maybe I have OneDrive for Business and I've started a document that I need to work on. And then I move it to my team because it's time for my team to be able to help me to finish it up and work on it. So I've actually added that document into my team environment, and I'm co-authoring and collaborating with my team. And let's just say, for example, it's a policy that I want to share with everyone else in the organization. And so our department has finalized this policy. It's ready to go. Once that's done, I need to move it someplace so that my users can consume that information, and that I can share that information with my users in a way that that they're able to see and get it. Let's just add something else to that, and that is that social aspect. I can drop something into my SharePoint environment, and nobody will know that it exists. But if I use Yammer to announce that a new policy has been implemented and a new policy has been provided and it is available to you in the SharePoint intranet, and I use Yammer to socialize that and to promote that, then I'm using virtually all of the tools that are available to me, or in a holistic perspective. Again, Teams for the collaboration environment where I'm developing the document, SharePoint for the consumption or the dissemination of that information, and then Yammer again to socialize that and to get the information out. The other thing that I think is important is when we talk about having a SharePoint environment already existing, whether you've migrated that into Office 365 or it's sitting in an on-prem environment and you're really trying to figure out what to do with it, is to start to look at the content that you have there in terms of the tools that you're going to be using in Office 365. Not just lifting and shifting and not just migrating and moving content like we've always done. And when we do that, we talk about things like news and announcements, where if you've had a SharePoint environment for a while, news and announcements is something that's difficult to keep up. You have to have somebody on staff to be able to keep up with that. Well, maybe if we start using Yammer as the place for news and announcements, when we move into Office 365 and we use SharePoint, then we can consume the Yammer feed inside of our intranet, inside of SharePoint, and be able to provide those news and announcement items to our users, but using the tool that it was created and is intended to be for that purpose. Again, we're making our intranet and our SharePoint environment the central hub, but we're also using Yammer for its purpose for news and announcements. And so we're consuming that using the Yammer web parts to be able to display it on the website so that people have one central location to go to. The other thing that you can do there too is, and you'll notice that we'll sort of jump back and forth here, but in SharePoint, I can have a web part that shows the teams that I belong to, so that from my intranet homepage, I can go to the teams that are available to me. In Teams, if I wanted to have a particular SharePoint site that my team had quick access to, I can make it a tab because the SharePoint connector is there. So the idea is to put the content in the right location and then consume it in the other applications so that your users have a really great user experience and can access the data that they're looking for immediately. I'm going to flip back to the slides we started with and really where we talk about getting real ROI. Because if we look at it from the perspective of defining the tools, governing those tools and letting users run off and do their thing and govern them on the back end with the policies that you put in place, and then having a plan for how each tool fits into what purpose it is and what you're trying to do in the organization, then adoption is really a tangible thing, because users are excited about being and participating in this new in the applications and the new processes that you're giving to them. You're talking to them about things that are exciting to them and that they're not just being thrown at them and forced to use because that's what they've always done. Again, all generations being, the tools are so simple. I taught somebody who had been in his workplace for 40 years how to use a communication site template, and in 10 minutes he had a beautiful site set up and it was functioning and he could then promote it. He was so excited that he went to others who were struggling with the same thing and was able to help them to then do the same thing. When you have those multi-generations working together, but also able to use those tools and excited about it, again, that goes back to real adoption. and your modern workplace or your intranet, right? We just talked through how using the right tool at the right time and for the right purpose. We don't have internet permission issues anymore because we're using Teams for collaboration and creating that content. And when we don't have a need for 20 people in a department to have edit permissions inside a SharePoint document library, you don't have the checkout files that you had issues with. You don't have to give somebody permissions, and you don't have those granular permissions that we've always struggled with. I think I talked plenty about news and announcements, right? How Yammer is used for that. And when we use Yammer for the right purpose and consume Yammer data inside of your SharePoint environment, then you don't need to worry about those customized news or announcements, or even calendars for that matter. So from a network and privacy perspective, I think the most critical thing is when you give users the tools that they want to use and they start using them, the thing that you're going to begin to see are people moving files themselves. And the number of files that get moved, typically we do a migration and we plan a migration tool and we use a migration tool to lift and shift and move files over. But the real excitement that I have and that I see when users actually understand what it is that they're doing, you've helped them to understand the purpose of the tool enough that they're actually cleaning data out themselves. So maybe somebody's got 10 years of files that have been migrated 3 times, but you introduce Teams to them and they know, I can make this happen. I can create a team for myself. It might be a little more work for me if I just moved everything at once. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up as I go. I've had people almost dare me that was not going to happen in their organization, and watching it happen actually is really, I think it's more gratifying for me to see the change in the organization than anything else. But seeing users take on the tools and wanting to participate and actually cleaning out data is really unbelievable. Again, that ties back to if your data is old inside a SharePoint environment, then you're going to have search issues. You're going to have things that show up in search that you don't necessarily want to see. And if we start from the perspective of defining the tools, this is where the IT gets so much benefit, is that if we talk about the definition of the tools, then your IT staff doesn't have to worry and wonder about how it is that you implement a process. So if a user comes and says, well, how would I use this, and what tool would I use for this process, and help me to understand this? All they have to do is go back to the definitions that, again, you've written down because you have a plan, and help them in that way. You've got a clear definition of what they're supposed to be doing, and they're able to support the users because the tools are simple. Microsoft has some great online videos that are available to you. The tools are simple. The difficult process is getting users to understand when they're supposed to use them and how they do. So that helps your IT group. I'm going to make another point too about the governance and the governance of the tools. It's nearly impossible to govern anything if you haven't decided how it is that you're going to define it, because how do you write a policy for every single possible scenario that you have? So if you've decided that you're not going to share outside of the organization, well, you can write a policy that says if somebody is doing something that looks like it's moving files around in order to do that, then you can monitor for that. If you've got you don't have to worry about opening up Teams for external sharing. If you're talking about only having OneDrive available for external sharing in your organization, that's a very easy thing to govern. And the reduction in email traffic, I can tell you, I have one customer who in 6 months from the beginning of adoption, and we weren't even completely through, we had migrated nearly 100 terabytes of data out of their shared drive into Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, simply by telling the users where to do it. And the majority of that migration happened because they wanted to do it on their own. They didn't use a tool. They weren't forced to do it. They got excited about it and doing it. But the email traffic, in 6 months, we went from 4 million emails in 1 month down to 1 million emails a month. And that number continues to drop. There's a process that's in place that's still requiring that email to be kind of high. And there's some server traffic that is being worked on moving those servers into the cloud. But that's significant. That's 75% reduction in email in 6 months. That wasn't even complete adoption and migration at that point, but that's a significant reduction in email. And if you can't see that as real ROI within your organization, then we need to adjust the communication and the conversation that we're having with users so that they see the potential and the benefits of that. Governance and change management, we're going to cover this really specifically, and we're going to deep dive into this in our next webinar, and I look forward to sharing some of this with you. But the keys here are, we can't approach Office 365 the way we always have implemented software, and that is, this isn't a let's get requirements and then let's write it down and let's implement, and then we're going to hand it off to our users, and then we're going to train them, and then we're going to go through some adoption activities. I said this earlier, adoption and change management have to start from the very beginning. The words that you use, the words that you carefully decide to use, the definitions of the tools and how you intend for them to use it and to get them excited about it is so important from beginning to every evolution and the future of what's going to be delivered from Microsoft to your organization. And this last one to me is so key. Don't try to control the use and adoption of the tools. This goes back to the comment that I had heard earlier about the sprawl that we're going to get. I may end up with 1,000 teams. Well, that's a really good thing, right? Because that means that your users are really trying to participate and trying to be engaged, and you want that. But don't be afraid of that happening. Let's switch it around and not talk about controlling the growth, but let's talk about governing the growth. And we can do things like, if a team hasn't been touched in 6 months, then let's put a policy in place to notify somebody that their team hasn't been used in 6 months, and they should look at it and make sure that it doesn't need to be deleted or archived, and give them the opportunity to do that. But you switch the messaging or the thought process around controlling that we've always, everyone who's ever been in IT, that's our first gut instinct, but you switch it from controlling and owning, and let the users take control. And when you let the users have that power, it's amazing what you'll actually see, and the adoption that you'll have of the tools. So let's talk about some key takeaways from today. The very beginning, we should talk about a core team. Get others in the organization, across the organization, from all levels. Sometimes I discourage executive level participation because in many ways, if you're getting users who are just in the beginning stages of their career, sitting in a room trying to make decisions with an executive can be intimidating. But most of the time, those users are the ones who have the most input and who are going to have the most value to what it is that you're trying to do. They're the ones who are going to use the tools every day and who have been frustrated by some of the things that have been rolled out to this point. So create your core team, and then when it's time, you present your plan and your strategy to the at the executive level, and get their buy-in. More than likely, that's going to save them some time. They're not participating, and they're going to appreciate the fact that you've come to them with ideas that have been started with that core team. Again, define each tool, its purpose, what you want the users to do with that tool, and really how you expect them to use it within the organization. Govern around each tool, put policies in place that are specific to those decisions that you've made. It's all in the story. How we tell the story and what message we get is going to make the difference. If I tell people that an example I use, that 100 terabytes of data, we knew that the end goal was to shut down that server, that we wanted to get the users off of that shared environment. But if we had gone in and started by saying, I'm going to shut down the server and we're going to force you to move all of your files over, those users would have dug their heels in and they would have said, no way at all. But instead, we changed the message and we said, we're going to give you some really great tools that are going to fill some of the gaps that you've had with this other tool. We're going to show you how those tools are used and help you to understand how you can benefit from them. And then they started moving their files on their own. We didn't have the heels that got dug in. So it's all in the way that you deliver it. It's all in the message that you have. And again, write your plan down. You've got to put it down, because if it's not in writing, then it's not a plan. And get your users excited. I love watching the faces of people who start to, sort of come in and they're not bought in yet. And once they start to see the power of what we have going on with the tools that Microsoft has put in our hands, seeing the excitement and generating that excitement is going to do more for adoption and ultimately ROI than anything. And I said this, change management, we've got to start having conversations about change management. Change is a scary thing, but it's not a bad thing. So we've got to figure out what story we have to tell to encourage people to adopt the tools. And again, encourage the sprawl and then govern the heck out of it. All right, so we're gonna open the, I think we're gonna go back to Diane with some questions from you guys.
Thank you, JoAnna. That was really informative. We're now going to begin answering some of the questions that were submitted during today's webinar. And notice there was a common theme around the questions. Many of you were asking, how do I get buy-in from my C-suite or my CTO or the upper management? How would you approach that?
So many times when we're talking to executives, they're worried about the risk to the organization. They're worried about what am I going to, when I'm spending money and when I'm implementing these, what am I doing? Obviously, getting a return on your investment for what you're already paying is critical. So if you've got server space that you're using and you can reduce spending by moving content into Office 365 where you're already spending, that's a good thing. The other thing is security. When we talk about the users that have, when we talk about how most organizations have users who are taking their intellectual property outside of the Office 365 walls and putting them in things like Dropbox and Trello and others, where you're really talking about a security risk, because every time you move content outside of your organization, there is potential for somebody to share it with somebody that they're not supposed to, or somebody to get access to it. The tools that are available to govern access into Office 365 and maintain some kind of governance over the documents or what people are allowed to do is a critical piece to securing your intellectual property. And really just the security in general that comes from being in Office 365.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Another common theme that we're seeing from the questions coming through is, why do I have to involve all of the staff in the decision making? If we do that, nothing is ever going to get done because we have too many people trying to make decisions, but there's no consensus. So how would you approach that?
So I talked about how getting buy-in from across the organization and getting people excited and getting people engaged and change management is key. And even if I've sat with organizations where they've decided that they want to make preliminary decisions about what they want to do with the content that exists there, or with the applications that exist, maybe they have a preliminary idea, but even getting others in the organization involved in the process from the beginning and having them feel like they are active participants and helping the organization to be more efficient, to be more collaborative, to move things forward. You get them engaged and then they do nothing but help you drive adoption, because they're the ones who are going to explain and help other users in their areas and outside of their areas to take on the tools and continue to use them.
Okay, that makes sense. I've got a couple more questions. So one person with, this is a really good question. What's the biggest pushback you get from clients when you're trying to implement strategy? Mm-hmm.
So the biggest pushback, interesting. I think the biggest pushback that we have, or the biggest question that we get when we start talking about this is, obviously this is a different perspective than you couldn't go and search this on, you don't have materials on this, right? So it's a new approach, it's a new thought process, and so it's a little scary. But the pushback that we typically get is, I just want to make the decisions and I just want to roll it out and I just want to do this and nobody's going to use it anyway, right? So in order to help that, we talk about and show the potential for change. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it does. Okay, and our last question, this is more specific, but this is great. So do you have any recommendations for how to support code sharing internally? So would you do it with Yammer, with Teams? So this sounds, yeah, it sounds like from the IT department. So if you wanted to share code with each other, more of a technical question. So it's a really good question.
So I would say in terms of code sharing, the file types, if you're talking about the file types and collaborating on that. So typically, Microsoft offers some connections within Teams. And so using Teams in a collaborative environment, but then creating the connectors that are available to things like Jira or other connectors that are available, or if you're a developer, creating a connector on your own in order to be able to provide that to your team. So you're using Teams in a collaborative way with the ease and use that you have, but you're using the connector to connect to that application that actually gives you the benefit of that code management and repository.
Yep. And to follow up with that question, how could you do that share securely?
With external users.
Mm-hmm.
So that would take a little more conversation around how to make that happen. But if you've already got a third-party application, or you're already using an application where you're sharing already, and you create that connector inside of your team, then you're really doing the same thing. Your external users might be connecting to that application directly, but you might be connecting to the application from within your connector inside of Teams. If you're talking about opening up Teams externally, that's a different conversation and a much deeper conversation to have about what would need to happen inside your tenant and also within Teams in order to allow external collaboration.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so for the last question, what is one of the biggest mistakes you typically see when clients try to implement this strategy? On their own, I should say.
So obviously, I talked about this earlier, where what people have done up until now has just been to roll it out, just open it up and let people use it. But if you take a step back, no matter where you are in your journey and no matter how far you've gotten, even if you're at the point where you've rolled it out and people are starting to use it and you have pockets, it's still worth the effort and the energy to take a step back and define, because people want you to tell them what they're supposed to be doing. And when you tell them what it is that they're supposed to be doing, it's very easy for them to do just that. And they're not being forced to do it. They just want to know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And so I think the key that's missing when most people implement, even if they have an idea and a plan for when they're going to roll out tools, and notice I said when, because that's a key, not how and what's the plan and what are the tools going to be defined as, is the lack of telling the users what you expect of them and what tool they're supposed to be using and for what purpose.